Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, also known as SGMA. Following the third year of a historic drought, the state passed a series of bills that we refer to as SGMA, and would become the framework for how groundwater would be managed throughout California. Since then, TID and its partners in the Turlock Subbasin have been developing and revising its plan to sustainably manage groundwater in our region. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Director of Water Resources and Regulatory Affairs, Michael Cooke, to discuss the recent milestone we've reached with SGMA, what has changed in the plan over the last 2 years, and what the next phase of SGMA looks like for TID and our growers. Michael, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Thank you, Constance. Happy to be here.
I should say welcome back to the TID Water and Power Podcast, as this is the second time that you've joined us. The first time you were here, you were talking about the relicensing of the Don Pedro project back in episode 3. And we know that relicensing is an ongoing effort. And while I look forward to you coming back and joining us on the podcast to tell us that we do, in fact, have a new license for Don Pedro, that's not why we're here today. So today, we're going to talk about updates to TID's efforts as they relate to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. So for those listeners who haven't yet listened to episode 3, why don't you start by telling us about your background with the district?
In 2020, I joined TID as Director of Water Resources and Regulatory Affairs. I have two main areas of responsibility. First, the relicensing of Don Pedro, and secondly, groundwater implementation of SGMA.
Okay. So what is your role specifically as it relates to SGMA and groundwater at TID?
We have to make sure that TID is complying with SGMA. And I also serve as the chair of the Technical Advisory Committee for the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And I'm also the plan manager for the Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan.
All right. And we're going to dive into what each of those mean here as we go through our time together. But why don't we start with kind of a little bit of a background on SGMA. So back in episode 10, we had your colleague, Herb Smart, on the podcast to talk to us about SGMA. And that was right after a significant milestone in TID's SGMA process. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But let's start with a refresher. What is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act?
SGMA is a regulation of groundwater to make sure that groundwater is used sustainably. So in California, groundwater is a diminishing resource. It was being used faster than it was being replaced. And so California is one of the last states to regulate groundwater. And previously, groundwater had only been regulated through the courts and local ordinances. It was essentially self-regulated. And SGMA came in during an historic drought, the driest 4 years on record. And basically, the state of California said, how do we ensure that groundwater is used responsibly and sustainably? So SGMA set the framework in which groundwater use will be regulated throughout the state. So rather than a statewide blanket of restrictions on groundwater, SGMA put focus on local management of groundwater. Then Governor Jerry Brown said groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally.
Which I think makes a lot of sense because our groundwater basins and just the territory from one area to another is so different. And we'll talk a little bit about even just the differences with our next door neighbors. So I think it totally makes sense to keep that management local.
That's correct. So the way we do that, it requires local agencies to form groundwater sustainability agencies, or we call them GSAs. And what the GSAs do is develop groundwater sustainability plans, GSPs. And the GSPs are intended to achieve groundwater sustainability over the next 20 years. It's like a bank account. If you're in deficit spending, you either have to spend less or earn more to bring yourself back into even keel. So there's 515 regions in the state, and 94 had to submit plans.
Okay. And that was based on the 94 that had to submit plans. Why were they called out specifically?
Well, those were considered high-priority basins where groundwater overdraft was the biggest problem. Okay. And the Turlock Subbasin was considered high priority, but it was not critically overdrafted, which was a good thing, and that's primarily it wasn't critically overdrafted because of the surface water that we have access here at TID. So we had until January 2022 to submit our GSP. The critically overdrafted basins had to submit their GSPs in 2020.
Okay. So those that were kind of in a worse situation than TID were part of the earlier group that had to submit their plans in 2020, whereas we had until January 2022.
That is correct.
Okay. So for some geographical perspective, can you describe for me kind of where the Turlock Subbasin is located, or sort of what kind of outlines our subbasin? Okay,
so the Turlock Subbasin is about 350,000 acres. The Tuolumne River is to the north. The Merced River is to the south, the San Joaquin River is to the west, and the foothills is to the east. So, and then within the Turlock Subbasin, we formed two GSAs, the west and the east Turlock GSAs. So the dividing line between those two GSAs is based on access to surface water. So the west Turlock GSA is defined generally by the TID service area, and the east Turlock GSA is the area east of TID that does not have access to surface water. The West Turlock GSA is about 210,000 acres, and in that area we have not only TID, but the cities of Ceres and Houston, Modesto, Waterford that represents Hickman. We also have Delhi, Denair, Hillmar, Keys, Stanislaus County, and Merced County. And the East Turlock GSA is about 140,000 acres and has some smaller water districts like Belico Cortez and Eastside Water District, but also Merced County, a small portion of Merced Irrigation District, and Stanislaus County. And both GSAs adopted and submitted a single GSP that was submitted to DWR before the January 31, 2022 deadline.
Okay. So thank you for that. But just to recap real quick, so we've got the Turlock Subbasin. That is split into an east and west, and then you have different cities, different towns, different counties that are in each that east and west subbasin. But they had to come together to create this GSP, or Groundwater Sustainability Plan, that was submitted in January 2022.
That's correct. So in our subbasin, we have two GSAs, but one GSP.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we submitted our plan about 2.5 years ago now. What's going on now? What's happening in the SGMA process as it relates to our area?
So as you said, we submitted about 2.5 years ago, and DWR had 2 years to review our GSP and provide comments. On January 18th of this year, DWR provided comments on our GSP and determined that our GSP was incomplete. And we were given 180 days to revise and resubmit the GSP, addressing the comments that DWR made in their letter. We adopted a revised GSP on July 11th this year and resubmitted it to DWR before the 180-day deadline.
Okay. So our GSP was deemed incomplete, and we'll come back to that in just a second. What were some of the other potential decisions that DWR, the Department of Water Resources, could have made?
Well, they could have approved our GSP out of the gate, and that would have meant we could start implementing our GSP right away.
So when you say we would have started implementing, what does that mean?
So based on the projects and management actions included in the GSP that would move us towards sustainability, we would start implementing those right away. So constructing projects and implementing management actions that would increase recharge, reduce pumping, or whatever to move us towards sustainable groundwater use in the Turlock Subbasin.
Okay. So obviously getting an approved GSP would have been the ideal. What was it about our plan exactly that they didn't like or that they wanted to see improved?
So there were two main areas that DWR identified deficiencies in our GSP. First off, they wanted us to address the near-term impacts of declining groundwater levels. So basically in the Turlock Subbasin, groundwater levels were going to get worse before they get better. Remember, we had a 20-year timeline to implement, to get to sustainability, and we knew things would get worse before they got better. But DWR asked us to identify what could happen under those conditions and how we could mitigate any potential negative impacts. And the second issue they wanted us to provide more details on projects and programs that would reduce groundwater overdraft and increase groundwater levels in a more expedited manner. And basically, they were concerned that the projects that management actions we put together initially would not improve groundwater overdraft quickly enough.
Okay. So our plan, as we said earlier, was submitted kind of with that second round of plans. We were part of the 2022 group as opposed to the 2020 group. So a couple years after the first plans were turned in, do you think that had an impact on how our plan was evaluated, the fact that they had already seen this first group of plans come through?
We think so. Obviously, SGMA was a new regulation, and as DWR reviewed more plans, they got to see what people were submitting, what they liked and what they didn't like. And I think have now developed more clear guidelines of what they're actually looking for in a GSP and how they score those GSPs. Again, the state has looked at a number of GSPs since 2020, when those critically overdrafted GSPs were due. And we submitted our plan 2 years later in 2022, and we think scoring criteria have developed and evolved after, since 2020. And again, a lot of plans were put together very quickly. We're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. We just had the regulation to go with. But as DWR have reviewed plans and understood plans and recognized some of the issues, I think their scoring criteria have come into focus more. And they use that to evaluate our plan. Since the adoption of our plan, TID's looked at what others have done and have given us more time to see what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think that's been to our advantage too. So I think in revising our plan, we've actually put a better project together because we've seen what's worked and what hasn't worked for others. And also and when we initially submitted our GSP, it was in the middle of a drought. And since that time, we've had a couple of wet years, and that's allowed us to kind of fine-tune some of our recharge projects and allowed us to better evaluate how we can increase recharge in the Turlock Subbasin.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what was the general feeling for TID and the West Turlock Subbasin regarding DWR's determination on the plan?
Well, obviously, we were disappointed. We put a lot of work in, and we were hoping for approval. But on the other hand, we only had 2 specific areas to address, and we had 2 years of information and opportunity to develop projects and better understand the subbasin and what was going on with groundwater conditions in the Turlock area. And, other GSAs and GSPs had been in the same situation. Only about half of them were ever approved in the 2020 plans or the 2022 plans. So we know it wasn't going to be easy to get a plan approved right away. But again, we were disappointed not to get approved. But on the other hand, we do have some time now we had some additional time to make some changes, and we feel we've come up with a better plan because of that.
Okay. So before we get into kind of exactly what we addressed in the revised plan, let's talk a little bit about the differences between East and West GSAs. And I kind of referenced this at the beginning that we're in a very different situation than our neighbors immediately to the east of us. So can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
That's correct. So the West Turlock GSA is everything within TID service area. East Turlock is everything east of Turlock Irrigation District. And so the East Turlock GSA doesn't have access to surface water from the Tuolumne like the West. They're entirely dependent on groundwater. There are a few parcels that do get some surface water from Merced Irrigation District. So the West Turlock is actually a net recharger of the aquifer of about 90,000 acre-feet annually, where the East Turlock GSA, on the other hand, runs about 170,000 acre-feet of deficit every year.
Wow, that is a pretty stark difference. And why is it so different from one area to the next?
It's basically all about access to surface water. So again, TID has access to surface water, and then East Turlock does not, other than those few growers that have access to Merced Irrigation District's Northside Canal. Okay.
All right. So what did we do to address the 2 incomplete areas of the GSP?
So DWR wanted the subbasin to address and mitigate the initial dip below the minimum threshold. So we had set 2015 as a benchmark for our minimum threshold. That was the worst part of the last significant drought, and when water levels reached their lowest level. And we saw the impacts that it had on wells and other beneficial users. And we said and put in our GSP together, we don't want to see water levels go below that level again. But we felt like we could manage at that level because we'd seen that level of groundwater before. We'd seen the impacts, and we knew we could get through that with some work, but we didn't want to see the water levels get below that level. Anyway, so initially, though, with our GSP, they do go slightly below that area in the initial few years of our plan. And so DWR wanted us to analyze what would happen in the first few years of our plan, how would it impact well users and others, and how we could potentially mitigate those impacts. And so what we did is sharpened our projects and management actions. We ran a number of modeled scenarios to see what would happen under various hydrologic conditions and how we could implement or ramp up our programs to make sure we could avoid significant adverse impacts.
All right. And so then how did we address DWR's critique over needing additional details on our projects?
So we better defined the projects listed in the GSP, and we added some new projects. West Turlock, for instance, has more projects than we had before, and also more projects in East Turlock GSA. We're actually not working on demand reduction, which is reduced pumping. We're focusing more on projects to bring us into increased recharge and move us towards sustainability. So some of the key projects in the West Turlock GSA, as you may know, the Stanislaus Regional Water Authority, that drinking water project went online in the fall of 2023. TID is selling surface water to the cities of Ceres and Turlock for drinking water supply. And what that's meant is a 50% reduction in urban pumping.
Wow,
and
that's significant.
Yeah, so urban pumpers in the West Turlock GSA pump about 30,000 acre-feet per year. And now with the SRWA project going online, that pumping's now gone down to 15,000 acre-feet. So 50% reduction.
That's great.
TID has constructed the Ceres main reservoir, the regulating reservoir, and that was completed in August of 2023. And that's reduced groundwater pumping by about 10,000 acre-feet per year. So we often use groundwater to top up the canals. We don't need to do that as much now with the regulating reservoir.
And that's actually the second regulating reservoir that we've seen that sort of impact on. When we implemented our lateral 8 regulating reservoir, we saw a big reduction in groundwater pumping in that area as well.
And that's true. And we also have another one in the works as well.
Awesome.
So a good way to go. We've been partnering with the City of Turlock on groundwater recharge at the Diam Storm Basin. So the TID board has approved various groundwater recharge projects. For instance, we're partnering with the City of Turlock in recharging water at the Diam Basin. We also have a number of agricultural-related recharge projects. We have our on-farm recharge project, our FloodMAR, so flood-managed aquifer recharge project, and then using surface water on idle lands for recharging the aquifer. We started some of these pilot projects last year and have improved them and expanded them this year. And you can learn more about our recharge projects at www.tid.org/recharge.
And of course, we also have a podcast about groundwater recharge, and that was episode 34, if any of our listeners want to go back and check that out as well. And what are some future projects that we'll be working on under our revised GSP?
So we're looking at another regulating reservoir at lateral 5.5. That'll have the same impact as the Ceres main reservoir and could also allow us to integrate recycled water into our irrigation system. And we're also working on an ambitious canal automation program, which will improve the efficiency of our surface water deliveries, which again could reduce the amount of groundwater pumping we do.
Okay. And what about projects on the east side?
East side is looking at a number of projects, getting more surface water from Merced Irrigation District through a new pipeline. They're also looking to get what we call replenishment water from TID. It's a program we already have to provide growers in the East Turlock GSA with surface water when supplies are available. We're trying to expand that program up to about 35,000 acre-feet per year. On average, they'll probably get about 25,000 acre-feet because that water is not always available. It's only available in years when TID growers have a full allotment of surface water. And so to receive that water, a certain amount of infrastructure will need to be constructed over time to increase the volume of water they can take from TID. They're also working on a number of recharge projects, like using streams like Sand Creek and Mustang Creek to capture stormwater in the winter and use that for recharge. And they're also looking at taking stormwater in the Highline Canal and using that to recharge land there in the East Turlock GSA. All our projects involve working together to focus on regional solutions.
Oh, that's great. The revised GSP focuses more on East Turlock Subbasin GSA's demand reduction plan than the original. Is that right?
That's correct. While the East Turlock GSA has some projects, their main focus to get towards groundwater sustainability relies on demand reduction. So what this means is a 30% reduction in groundwater use over time. This means that about 21,000 acres will be removed from irrigated ag production over time. That program has kind of two main prongs. Firstly, a use and allocation program. So growers will be charged for the groundwater use. There'll be a tiered pricing program. Trading will be allowed. So basically, the more you use, the more you pay, and you can move your water between parcels or sell it to another grower. And then they'll use the funding from that program to implement projects to reduce demand. So they're looking at repurposing land, retiring land, rotational fallowing, and other direct and in-lieu recharge projects and programs. By 2027, we hope those projects will reach an inflection point, that those projects and programs will make a difference. We'll see groundwater levels start to stabilize and stop their decline and hopefully start to rise again. The main thing in the East Turlock GSA is they've committed to adaptive management. This means they'll either escalate or de-escalate their groundwater use restrictions based on real-time conditions in the aquifer.
Adaptive management. Can you tell us more about what that is exactly?
Yeah, so the way the plan's put together, over time, over the first 5 years, they'll reduce groundwater demand by 10%. The next 5 years will be another 10%. The next 5 years, another 10%. So over 15 years, they reduce demand by 30%. But if there's a significant drought, they'd have to escalate the demand management program and maybe go to 20 or 25% right away because groundwater conditions are falling faster than we projected in the plan. But if our programs are working well and we have a number of wet years and the aquifer is rising, maybe they won't have to put as severe cuts in as they had imagined in the plan.
Okay. Yeah, because that's a really good point. You had mentioned earlier that we anticipate things to get worse before they get better, but we really have no idea what those coming years are going to look like. Are we going to stay wet? Are we going to move back to a dry scenario? So that plays a huge impact on how the plan is actually implemented.
Right. At the end of the day, it's a plan, but it no plan survives reality. So we have to figure what's happening on the ground and then adapt accordingly.
Right. Okay. What else is in the revised GSP that we should take note of?
Yes, we have a well mitigation plan. So we've developed a memorandum of understanding between the West and East Turlock GSAs to mitigate the impacts to domestic wells. And by mitigation, I mean there's short-term and long-term mitigation we're considering. So short-term would be, for instance, a well goes dry, and we provide bottled water or tanked water until we develop a long-term solution. Other long-term solutions may be deepening a well, redrilling a well, or totally replacing a well. And the goal is to complete the program guidelines by January 2025, addressing long-term and short-term issues, finish everything up by the end of the year, and start implementation by January of 2025. Are
there a number of wells that are at risk?
Yeah, we looked at those first few years of the GSP where water levels could go below the 2015 minimum threshold, and we estimated about 85 wells, or about 1.1% of all the wells in the subbasin, are at risk of going dry if those groundwater levels go below the minimum thresholds. But the goal is to prevent that from happening in the first place rather than mitigate the impacts if they arise.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so what does all of this mean as far as the programs and projects that are being implemented, the changes to our approach to groundwater? What does this mean to TID growers and customers?
Nothing immediate on the action side, but we need to recognize that groundwater is a precious resource, and we need to understand it better. For instance, the subbasin has a groundwater model and a groundwater monitoring network, and we will need to collect well data, and we may need help and cooperation from our growers in developing additional monitoring wells.
And what does this monitoring network look like exactly?
Well, it's a combination of TID wells and city and urban wells, and also we're constructing a number of new wells that are owned by the GSA.
Okay, and so it'll just be tracking the levels of those wells to see how they're faring.
That's correct.
Okay. What about other impacts to growers or any impacts to growers?
So as we implement the GSP, we have goals to reach, and we have to stay within what's called a sustainable yield. So we can only use so much groundwater in the basin. So again, we've defined sustainable management criteria. We have undesirable results. We have minimum thresholds. We have to make sure we stay inside all of those boundaries. And we need to know where we are with groundwater at all times and manage the resource accordingly and adapt to changing conditions. We've also developed some kind of well regulations for new wells and well permits. And so those who are applying for well permits in either West Turlock or East Turlock GSA, one of the steps now is to get approval from the GSAs.
Mm. And that was not part of the well process prior?
No, before you just went to the county, either Stanislaus County or Merced County, and they would issue the permit. But now there's an extra step where the GSA has to sign off on the well application and say that the well will not adversely impact the implementation of the GSP.
So one extra step for the person wanting to implement the new well, but also a big step in kind of helping to coordinate what's going on out there and sort of coordinate our approach to a solution. That's correct.
It also just gives new well owners just a heads up of that groundwater management is happening in the Turlock Subbasin.
Mm-hmm.
The GSP also kind of informs where TID rents its wells for supplemental supply. We're looking at the locations where we have typically rented wells during dry years and understanding whether they're good locations or whether we should maybe pump less in certain locations based on groundwater levels. I would encourage our growers to maximize their use of surface water when it's available so we can maximize recharge. I'd also encourage growers to participate in the recharge projects that TID has available.
We'll be monitoring wells and just general conditions. We're encouraging our growers to participate in the various recharge projects that are available to them. What will the GSA be doing from their side of things?
Well, every year we have to submit an annual report to the state of California what we're doing to implement the GSP. We also do semi-annual well monitoring. So every spring and every fall, we go out and measure all of our monitoring wells to see where we are with groundwater conditions. And we also have both the West Turlock and East Turlock GSAs have a board who oversee the implementation of the GSP and the work of the technical advisory committees. They will continue to be involved in the SGMA process.
And when do we anticipate hearing back from the state on the revised plan?
There's no exact time frame. But we have heard the state anticipates getting back to us by the end of the year.
Okay. And then the potential scenarios that the state could come back to us with?
So first, approved. That would be the best. We would then begin implementing our GSP and work on our first 5-year revision, which is due actually in 2027. Mm. Or secondly, we would not be approved, and that would begin a probationary hearing process.
Probation doesn't sound good. What does that mean exactly?
That means intervention from the State Water Board. This means a pumping fee will be placed on each well and also a fee for every acre-foot pumped, and that would be paid directly to the State Water Board. The State Water Board would also limit the volume of water pumped from each well until the GSP is in compliance, even in the West Turlock GSA where groundwater use is sustainable. So it's strictly a tax. Funds are raised or captured by the state and not used locally for groundwater sustainability.
So in that scenario, if the state actually did have to step in, does that mean that they then take over management of groundwater in our area, or what does that look like exactly?
No, we would still be managing locally. We would just be paying fines to the State Water Board. In the meantime, locally, we would be constantly revising our GSP, trying to overcome the deficiencies, and so the State Water Board determines we have a GSP that meets the requirements, at that point we come off probation, stop paying the fines and penalties, and go back to groundwater sustainability plan implementation with DWR.
So both from a sense of wanting to control our own destiny and not wanting to have to pay fines on top of that, we definitely are going for that approval of our plan.
That's correct. People in the southern part of the valley have learned you don't want to get on probation with the State Water Board.
Makes sense. Anything else to add with regard to either TIDs or the GSA's participation in these groundwater efforts?
I would encourage everyone to visit our website, which is turlockgroundwater.org, for more information and to follow how SGMA is being implemented in the Turlock Subbasin.
All right. Well, Michael, thanks for joining us today and providing an update on where we are in the SGMA process. I look forward to hearing from you that our plan has been approved. Fingers crossed.
Sounds good, Constance.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.